In the last episode, I developed the preliminary drawing for my new painting. In this session, I'll be preparing the drawing for transfer, then transferring it to my watercolor paper. For the preparation stage, I'll be using a soft pencil, a piece of sacrificial paper, and the drawing itself. I'll be drawing on the reverse side of the tracing paper, which is the reason for the second piece of paper. The sacrificial paper serves two purposes: to make it easier to see the drawing and to prevent the graphite that I applied in developing the drawing, which will now be on the bottom side of the paper, from making a mess of my workspace. The paper can be any light-colored, opaque, smooth paper that's the same size or larger than the paper the drawing is on. Today I'm using the cover sheet from the pad of tracing paper. For this part of the process, I've flipped the tracing paper over so the subject is facing in the opposite direction. I then carefully and methodically redraw each of the lines. Today I'll be using a 6B pencil. I work generally from the upper left to the lower right, partly because that helps to keep the heel of my hand out of the graphite, keeping the drawing cleaner, and partly because doing so makes it easier for me to keep track of which lines I've drawn and which I still have to do. The pencil I'm using can be any soft grade from 4B to 8B. For this task, I don't want a sharp pencil. The goal here is to make lines that will transfer readily to my watercolor paper. I'm essentially making carbon paper, but with the carbon only where I need it, keeping the rest of the paper transparent. I want to draw fairly fat, juicy lines, a little wider than the lines I drew with the harder, sharper pencil in the last step, and loaded with enough soft carbon to transfer easily, possibly more than once. To check to see if I've missed any lines, I hold the paper up so that I can look at the drawing from a low angle. The light will reflect off my pencil line, making it easier to see if I've missed anything. Once I've finished drawing my subject on the reverse side of the tracing paper, I'm ready to transfer it to the watercolor paper I'll be doing the painting on. I use Arch's 140-pound cold-pressed paper almost exclusively. I buy the paper in full sheets, which measure roughly 22 by 30 inches, cutting it into halves or quarters for most of my work. This painting will be on a quarter sheet. The first thing I do in preparing my watercolor paper is to position the template I made previously in the center of the paper. The template is a piece of cardboard measuring 10 1/4 by 14 1/4 inches, slightly larger than the 10 by 14 inch opening I cut in a typical mat for this size painting. I then draw a light pencil line around it. Here's the guideline. With that, the paper is ready to be mounted to my painting board. The panel I'll attach my paper to is a piece of polycarbonate coroplast. It's flat, stiff, and waterproof, making it ideal as a painting surface. I've also used tempered hardboard and plywood for the same purpose. They work fine too, although they're not waterproof without varnishing them. That's usually not a problem though. I tape the paper down to my board using 1-inch painter's tape, taping carefully up to the lines I drew around the template. Doing this ensures that the finished painting will mat nicely with no white paper showing through the opening. The clean edges left by the painter's tape will also give me options in mounting the painting other than putting it behind a mat. To help ensure that the edges remain clean, I rub each of the inside edges of the tape to make sure they're thoroughly stuck down so no paint bleeds under them. I then flip the tracing paper with the preliminary drawing on it over so the subject is facing in the same direction as my reference photo, and tape it to the mounted watercolor paper. In doing the drawing, I traced short segments of the grid in each corner, just in case I needed to reattach it to the grid later on. I'm using those grid marks now to position the drawing within my taped opening. I tape the drawing using 2 short pieces of painter's tape on the top edge, attaching them hinge style. This will allow me to flip the tracing paper up to check my progress. It should fall back in precisely the same position. I've now switched back to the harder, sharper pencil again. For this stage, I want roughly the same precision that I was looking for in the first stage of the process. Working in the same order, roughly upper left to lower right, I draw each line in the drawing, flipping the tracing paper up to check for any missed lines fairly frequently. I check my progress frequently as I'm transferring the drawing. In a complicated drawing like this one, it's easy to overlook an area or important line, no matter how methodical I am. It's also easy to look at the transferred drawing as it becomes more and more crowded with details and think that I've gotten everything when I've missed a few lines in the middle of a particularly detailed area. Because I have the preliminary drawing on tracing paper, it's not the end of the world if I miss something. I can always re-register and add any omitted details, but it's much more convenient to get it all done now. The exception to that is if I know I'm going to be masking the main subject. In that case, I might skip transferring most of the interior lines in my main subject, including only enough information to be helpful in painting the masking fluid accurately. Then, after I've painted the background and removed the masking fluid, I transfer the lines that I'll need to paint my main subject. You may wonder why I don't just draw the scene directly on the watercolor paper. Unless the subject is fairly simple, using the method I'm demonstrating has a number of advantages. The first and possibly best reason for doing the preliminary drawing on tracing paper is that it almost always involves some erasing, correction, and redrawing of lines. Watercolor paper is fairly delicate stuff. Doing the revisions that are usually involved in the preliminary drawing, especially for a complicated subject like this, would almost certainly damage the surface of the paper, affecting the way the paint behaves, giving me less control and probably showing up in the finished painting. Tracing paper, on the other hand, is pretty tough. I can make mistakes and corrections here, and other than possibly making the drawing a little muddy, it will have no effect on the finished painting. The preliminary drawing is a tool in the process rather than the end product. If the painting gets a little smudged, it doesn't matter. Another really good reason for using this process is that in the event that I need to redraw any part of my subject on the watercolor paper, it's simply a matter of re-registering the tracing paper and transferring a second time. As I said before, I use a lot of masking fluid in my painting process, usually masking at least the main subject to allow me to paint the background fluidly rather than having to carefully cut around the subject. When the masking fluid is removed, it invariably takes most or all of the graphite from my preliminary drawing with it. Because I have the drawing on tracing paper, I can reattach it, registering it with a clean white paper cutout in the middle of the background, and retransfer the drawing of the main subject. I don't plan to mask any large areas in this painting, so here I'm transferring the entire drawing. I've found over the years that I've been using this process that having the tracing paper preliminary drawing is very valuable, well worth the effort involved in creating it. Another thing you may be wondering is why I don't just use carbon paper. One reason is that it would be one more thing to buy and store to keep on hand. Another is that carbon paper is difficult to get in larger sizes, so doing a full or half sheet or even the quarter sheet size I'm working on here would be challenging. Probably the best reason for using this process is that carbon paper isn't transparent, which would make registering the drawing difficult or impossible in the likely event that I needed to transfer part of it a second or third time. Once I'm satisfied I've finished the transfer process, I remove the painter's tape from the tracing paper and set the preliminary drawing aside in a safe place so it will be readily available if I need it again. Here's the completed drawing, transferred to the watercolor paper. In the next episode, I'll begin developing the painting, starting with applying masking fluid in the limited areas where I think it will be helpful. I hope you're enjoying these videos. If you are, please hit the like button. To be sure to see the rest of the series, please subscribe to my channel. If you also hit the notification button, YouTube will let you know when I post other episodes or start a new painting or drawing series. If you know others who might be interested in these demonstrations, please share my videos. Thank you for watching. See you in the next episode.